The afternoon sun cut through the high, narrow windows of the university concert hall, casting long, sharp beams of light across the rows of velvet seats. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you hold your breath without meaning to. Today wasn't just a normal class. Today, the university was hosting a master class with Julian Vane. To the music world, Julian Vane was a giant, a man who sold out arenas in Tokyo and New York, whose fingers could move faster than thought. To the students gathered here, he was a judge, a critic, and a terrifying idol all wrapped into one. Julian sat at the grand piano on the stage, leaning back with the kind of casual ease that only comes from knowing you are the best in the room. He was polishing a lint ball off his dark, expensive suit, looking mostly bored. In the seats below, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. The students had been waiting for hours. Some were whispering, their voices low and trembling as they checked their sheet music for the 100th time. Others were just staring at the floor, their stomachs turning over and over. Sitting near the back, tucked into a corner seat as if she were trying to hide behind the person in front of her, was Lily. Lily was not like the others. She didn't carry the expensive leather folder or wear the tailored clothes that most music students wore to impress. Her skirt was a simple cotton one she had found at a thrift store, and her shoes were sensible flats, worn at the heels from walking across campus every day. She was a scholarship student, the first in her family to go to college, and every day she felt like she was walking on a tightrope without a net. Lily held her music sheets in her hands. The paper was soft around the edges from years of use. She knew the music by heart, of course, but holding the papers felt like holding a shield. She looked at the stage. Julian Vane was talking to the university dean, laughing loudly at something that probably wasn't that funny. It was a laugh that commanded attention, a sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Lily's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had practiced for this. She had spent hours in the small, damp practice rooms in the basement, playing until her fingers ached and her eyes burned. But looking at the man on the stage, doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. He was a superstar. He was technical perfection. She was just a girl from a small town who loved the piano more than she loved herself. What did she have to offer him next? Julian's voice rang out. It wasn't a shout, but it carried that natural projection that all great performers have. He didn't even look up from his hands. A professor near the front door held up a clipboard and scanned the list. Lily, the professor called out. Lily Thompson. The sound of her name made Lily flinch. It felt final, like a verdict. The people around her shifted in their seats. A few students turned to look at her, their eyes scanning her simple clothes, maybe wondering why she was even there. The boy sitting in front of her, dressed in a crisp white shirt that looked brand new, turned around. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, then at the stage, and then back at her with a raised eyebrow, as if to say, "Good luck with that." Lily stood up. Her legs felt stiff, like they didn't belong to her. She smoothed down her skirt with shaking hands and picked up her bag. The walk to the stage felt like the longest walk of her life. The carpet was thick, swallowing the sound of her footsteps, making her feel like a ghost moving through the room. As she got closer to the stage, she could smell the polish on the floors and the faint scent of expensive cologne drifting from Julian. She climbed the 3 steps to the platform. The piano was huge, a black beast of wood and wire, sitting in the center. Julian Vane was sitting on the bench, but he didn't move to get up. He just watched her approach. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely unimpressed. He didn't see the years of practice or the passion she had. He just saw a girl in a cheap skirt walking slowly toward him. Lily reached the piano and set her sheet music on the stand. The metal rack made a small clink sound that seemed deafening in the quiet hall. She adjusted the bench, pulling it out slightly. She was aware that every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her back. She could feel the heat of their gazes. It made her skin prickle. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn around, run down the aisle, and go back to the safety of her dorm room. But she didn't. She sat down on the bench. It was firm and cool against her legs. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, trying to calm the trembling in her fingers. She took a breath, but the air felt too thin. She looked up at the keys. They were white and black, waiting for her. They were the same keys she practiced on every day. They were the same, and yet, everything was different. Julian tapped his pen against his chin. Tap. 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 The rhythm was slow, deliberate. He looked out at the audience, a bored expression on his face. He hadn't introduced himself to her. He hadn't asked her what she was going to play. He hadn't smiled or offered any encouragement. He just sat there, waiting for the entertainment to begin or, more likely, waiting for it to fail so he could make a clever comment and move on. The silence stretched out. It became painful. Lily felt the sweat gathering on her palms. She rubbed them on her skirt quickly, trying to dry them. She felt small. She felt like an intruder in a world of gold and diamonds. She looked out into the audience, seeing the blur of faces, the students who had money, who had connections, who belonged. And then she looked at Julian. He wasn't looking at her hands. He was looking at her face, but there was no kindness there. He shifted his weight, sighing loudly, and the sound cut through Lily like a knife. He was impatient. He was already deciding that she wasn't worth his time. The weight of his judgment settled on her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden. She knew that in a few seconds, she would have to prove herself, or she would become just another cautionary tale told in the practice rooms. She reached out and hovered her fingers over the keys. The C major scale felt miles away. This was the moment. The moment where the dream either lived or died. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to get louder, a buzzing noise that filled her head. She waited for him to say something, to give her a cue, to tell her to start. But he just sat there, tapping his pen, a predator waiting for the prey to make a mistake. The anticipation in the room was so thick you could almost taste it, metallic and sour. Lily took one last shallow breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to touch the keys, unaware that the next few seconds would change the course of her life entirely. Julian didn't let the silence last long. He looked at Lily, his eyes moving slowly up and down her simple frame, taking in the worn hem of her skirt and the slight trembling in her shoulders. It was the kind of look that makes you feel invisible, like a specimen under a microscope rather than a human being. He tapped the end of his pen against his teeth, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the nervous beating of Lily's heart. The audience in the hall was completely still. Everyone knew Julian's reputation. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also cruel. He didn't suffer beginners gladly, and he certainly didn't have patience for anyone he deemed unworthy of his time. You know, Julian said, breaking the quiet. His voice was smooth and rich, the kind of voice made for radio, but there was a jagged edge to it. We have a very serious schedule today. I was told I would be hearing the best of the best. He stood up from his bench slowly and walked a few paces away from the piano, stuffing his hands into his expensive pockets. He looked out at the sea of students, his face wearing an expression of exaggerated curiosity. He was playing a role, and he was playing it well. I received the program this morning, Julian continued, raising his eyebrows as if he were sharing a great secret. And I have to say, I was confused. I saw names of students who have won competitions. Students who have played with symphonies. And then, I saw your name. Lily sat frozen on the piano bench. Her hands were resting in her lap, knotted together so tightly her fingers were turning white. She felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickly sensation that started at her neck and moved upward. She wanted to look down, to look away, but she forced herself to stare straight ahead at the music stand. The black notes on the white paper began to blur slightly through her watering eyes. I don't mean to be rude, Julian said, though the tone of his voice suggested he didn't really care if he was rude or not. But I had to ask the dean, is there a mistake? Surely, there has been a mix-up in the scheduling. A few low chuckles rippled through the front rows. They were the students who dressed the best, the ones who had the most to lose and the most to prove. They laughed because it was safer to laugh with Julian than to risk being laughed at by him. Julian turned his back on the audience and walked closer to Lily, leaning against the side of the grand piano. He looked down at her, not with anger, but with a sort of lazy amusement. It was the way someone might look at a puppy trying to walk on slippery ice waiting for the fall. But then the dean told me no, Julian said, his voice dropping lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. He said you were a scholarship student. That you were, what was the word? Promising. He let the word hang in the air like a puff of smoke. He turned to the audience again, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. And you know, I love that word. Promising. It means you haven't actually done anything yet, but you might, eventually. Maybe. If the stars align. The laughter in the room grew a little louder. It wasn't open, mean laughter, but it was enough. It was the sound of a crowd turning against you. Lily felt her chest tighten. She thought about all the nights she had spent in the practice rooms in the basement, playing until 3 o'clock in the morning because the other rooms were taken. She thought about the blisters on her fingers and the times she had been too tired to eat properly. She had thought those things made her strong. But sitting here, under the bright lights, in front of this famous man, she just felt small. Julian looked back at her. So, before we begin this experiment, I feel the need to lighten the mood. We are all so serious, Aren't we? Music is supposed to be fun. He tapped the side of the piano gently. I heard a joke this morning that I think fits perfectly. It seems the university has expanded its arts program significantly this year. They are bringing in all kinds of new talent. He paused for effect, looking around the room to make sure he had everyone's attention. He did. In fact, Julian said, his voice bright with false cheerfulness. I heard that the admissions committee decided to branch out into performance art. They wanted to include interpretive dance. A ripple of genuine amusement went through the crowd. A few people clapped. It was a funny image to them, a serious music masterclass turning into a dance recital. But they didn't understand what he was really saying. Julian let the laughter die down before he delivered the punchline. He looked directly at Lily, his eyes locking onto hers. I'm joking, of course. But looking at you sitting there, I have to wonder. Are you here to play the piano, or are we supposed to guess what you're feeling? Should I be taking notes on your acting skills instead of your technique? The laughter exploded now. It was louder and sharper than before. It wasn't just a polite chuckle anymore, it was the sound of humiliation. Lily felt a hot tear spill over and run down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. She refused to let them see her cry. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Come now, don't look so tragic, Julian said, waving his hand dismissively. It's just a joke. We are all friends here. Except, well, we are waiting for some music. He walked back to the center of the stage, the master of his domain. I assume you have prepared something, or did you just come here to sit on the bench and look at the keys? Please, surprise me. Play us a lullaby. Just try not to put us to sleep before the coffee break. I need my energy for the next student. The audience quieted down, but the mood was ugly. They were waiting for a disaster. They were expecting her to freeze up, to apologize, to run off the stage in tears. It was a classic bullying tactic, dressed up in a tuxedo and presented as entertainment. Julian had turned the master class into a spectacle, and Lily was the main attraction. Lily sat there for a long moment. She felt the heat of the spotlight on her head. She felt the weight of 200 eyes watching her, waiting for her to fail. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to leave. To stand up, bow quickly, and walk out of the hall. She could go back to her dorm room. She could pack her bags. She could go home and forget she ever tried to be a musician. But then, she looked at the keys again. The ivory was smooth and worn. It was just wood and wire and felt. It didn't care who she was. It didn't care about her clothes or her scholarship or the cruel things Julian Vane had just said. The piano only cared about vibration. It only responded to pressure. She thought about the piece she had chosen. It wasn't a safe piece. It wasn't a pretty, gentle melody that would fade into the background. It was a monster of a song. It required force, anger, and power. It was the kind of music that punched you in the chest. She had chosen it because she loved it, but now she realized it was her only weapon. Julian leaned against the piano again, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at his watch, then back at her. Whenever you are ready, he sighed. We don't have all day. Lily took a breath. It wasn't a shaky breath anymore. It was a deep, slow intake of air that filled her lungs and cleared her head. She unclenched her hands in her lap. She stopped thinking about the mockery. She stopped thinking about the laughter. She closed her eyes for a split second and imagined herself back in the basement practice room, alone with the music, where no one could judge her. She opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keyboard. Her palms were dry now. Her fingers felt strong, like iron. She wasn't shaking anymore. The fear was still there, hiding in the corner of her mind, but she pushed it down. She locked it away. There was no room for fear in what she was about to do. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Julian had stopped tapping his pen. He was waiting, his lip curled slightly in anticipation of a mediocre performance. He expected her to be weak. He expected her to be quiet. Lily lifted her hands slightly, hovering over the keys. She didn't announce her piece. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at Julian. She just looked at her hands, poised and ready. The tension in the hall was stretched tight, like a rubber band ready to snap. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what the girl in the cheap skirt would do. And then, she brought her hands down. When Lily's hands came down, they didn't gently caress the keys. They struck them. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a melody, it was a crash. It was the musical equivalent of a slap in the face. She launched straight into the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. The famous three-note motif, sharp, heavy, and ominous, rang out through the hall like a hammer hitting an anvil. It was so loud that the people in the front row physically flinched, pulling back as if the sound waves had reached out and pushed them. Julian Vane, who had been leaning casually against the side of the piano with his arms crossed, stood up straight so fast he nearly knocked over his stool. His eyebrows shot up, disappearing under the line of his hair. The look of bored amusement on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sharp, alert confusion. He had expected a lullaby. He had expected a quiet, stumbling attempt at a simple piece. He had prepared himself to be bored. Instead, the air in the room was suddenly filled with the violence and power that no one had anticipated. Lily didn't stop. She didn't pause to let the sound fade. She drove into the next measure, her fingers moving like pistons. The low notes on the left hand thundered while the right hand tore through the rapid, jagged figures of the melody. The piano was a massive instrument, but under Lily's hands, it seemed to shrink. It was vibrating so intensely that the sheet music on the stand began to rattle. The silence that had filled the room only seconds before was shattered. Now, the hall was filled with a roaring, aggressive sound that demanded to be felt. The students who had been whispering and giggling were now deadly silent. The boy in the white shirt who had rolled his eyes at her earlier stared at the stage, his mouth slightly open. He looked at his program, then back at the stage, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected. But Lily didn't see any of them. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She wasn't playing to prove Julian wrong anymore, at least, not consciously. She was channeling every bit of anger, fear, and humiliation she had felt in her life into the piano. She thought about the nights she spent hungry because she couldn't afford food after buying her music books. She thought about the looks people gave her when they saw her worn-out coat. She thought about the cruel, lazy way Julian had mocked her. All of that went into her fingers. The music became her voice. The piece was technically demanding. It required a strength in the wrists that many young players simply didn't have. Lily's small arms were working incredibly hard, her shoulders lifting and falling with the rhythm of the music. But there was no strain in her posture, only determination. She was hitting the keys with absolute precision, turning the rapid clusters of notes into a terrifyingly fast storm of sound. As she approached the middle section of the prelude, the tempo became even more frenetic. The notes cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of stones. It was a blur of black and white keys under her flying fingers. The sound was overwhelming, filling every corner of the high-ceilinged hall. It bounced off the walls and the floor, creating a cacophony that felt almost dangerous. Julian took a step closer to the piano, his arms now hanging loose at his sides. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't checking his watch. He was listening. Really listening. He was a professional, a master of the instrument, and he knew exactly how difficult this piece was. He knew that playing it with this kind of speed and volume required a fearlessness that couldn't be taught. He looked at Lily's face. It was set in a grimace of concentration, her teeth slightly clenched, sweat beginning to glisten on her forehead. She wasn't smiling for the audience. She wasn't performing. She was fighting. The audience was paralyzed. In a masterclass setting, people usually listen politely, maybe glancing at their phones or their programs. But no one was moving now. It was as if the music had glued them to their seats. The girl they had dismissed as a nobody, a scholarship student who didn't belong, was dominating the room with a force of personality that was undeniable. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air. The famous pianist who had made fun of her was now standing in her shadow, looking small and silent. The noise grew louder and louder, a rolling wave of tension that seemed impossible to sustain. Lily's right hand was moving so fast it was almost a blur, hammering out the relentless rhythm. The strings inside the piano were screaming, the soundboard trembling. It was aggressive music, angry music, and it was perfect. Then came the moment of transition. Lily hit the final crashing chord of the fast section, and suddenly, she let the heavy dampers fall onto the strings. The roaring sound cut off abruptly, as if a door had been slammed shut. Instant, total silence. The sudden quiet was more shocking than the noise had been. The air in the hall felt like it had been sucked out. Lily held her hands hovering over the keys for just a heartbeat, her chest heaving. The transition in the music required a complete shift in energy. The anger was gone, replaced by something else entirely. She lifted her hands again, but this time, she touched the keys with the lightest possible touch. The mood of the piece shifted violently from aggression to deep, haunting sorrow. The melody that emerged was slow, thick, and heavy. It was like walking through deep snow. This was the part that required true control. Playing loud is easy, playing soft and making it carry to the back of the hall is incredibly difficult. Lily caressed the keys, drawing a sound out of the instrument that was like a human voice crying. The notes lingered in the air, hanging there like smoke. The contrast between the storm she had just played and this delicate, mournful melody was heartbreaking. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. His head tilted slightly to the side. The cynical mask was completely gone. He wasn't analyzing her technique anymore, he was just feeling the music. He heard the nuance in the way she stretched the timing, the tiny hesitations before a dissonant chord that made the emotion hurt even more. It was playing of a depth that he rarely heard, even from his famous peers. It was raw. It was honest. It wasn't showing off, it was bleeding onto the keyboard. The students in the audience felt it too. The mood in the room had shifted from mockery to awe. The judgment had evaporated, replaced by a strange kind of guilt. They realized they had been laughing at a genius simply because she didn't look the part. The boy in the white shirt looked down at his hands, ashamed of his earlier arrogance. Lily continued to play, her body swaying slightly with the phrases. She was lost in it now. The fear was gone. She wasn't thinking about Julian, or the school, or the money she didn't have. There was only the music, and the story it was telling. It was a story of pain, but also of survival. The melody climbed higher, becoming more desperate, pleading, before sinking back down into the low depths of the piano. She played with a maturity that seemed impossible for her age. She didn't rush. She let the silence between the notes speak just as loudly as the notes themselves. The audience leaned forward collectively, pulled into her world by an invisible string. No one was bored. No one was checking the time. Everyone was holding their breath, terrified that if they made a sound, the spell would break. The sorrowful melody wound its way through the final phrases, becoming softer and softer, fading away into nothingness. Lily played the last few notes with incredible delicacy, her fingers barely brushing the ivory. She held the final chord, letting it decay naturally, listening until the sound was just a ghost of a vibration in the air. The piece was over. But Lily didn't move. She sat with her hands on the keys, her shoulders rising and falling as she caught her breath. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't empty or bored. It was heavy. It was charged. It was the silence of 300 people realizing they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, pressing against the walls of the concert hall. It wasn't the awkward, waiting silence of a few minutes ago. It was a living, breathing thing. The final vibrations of the piano strings had faded into the air, leaving a ghost of a sound that seemed to hang above the stage. Lily sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, her shoulders rising and falling with the deep breaths she was taking to calm her racing heart. Her eyes were closed, her head bowed slightly. She looked small, almost fragile, in the huge chair, yet the power of what she had just done still seemed to echo in the room. For 5 seconds, no one moved. It felt like the entire world had stopped to listen to the quiet. In the front row, the students who had been ready to laugh were now staring blankly, their mouths slightly open. The boy in the crisp white shirt wasn't checking his watch anymore. He was gripping the edge of his seat so hard his knuckles were white. He looked up at the stage with a mixture of shock and confusion, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. How could the quiet girl in the second-hand skirt play like that? It didn't fit the picture he had in his head of how a musician was supposed to look or act. Then, from the back of the hall, a sound broke the spell. It was a single clap. It wasn't polite or slow. It was sharp and loud, striking the air like a gunshot. Everyone turned to look. An older man, a visiting professor who had been sitting in the shadows, was standing up. He clapped again, harder this time. Then another student stood up. Then another. Within moments, the quiet shattered. It wasn't just a ripple of applause, it was a wave. It started as a roar of surprise and then swelled into something deeper. It was the sound of people realizing they had been wrong. The entire room was on its feet, the clapping thunderous, echoing off the high ceiling like a storm. People were cheering, whistling, calling out her name. It was chaotic and loud and completely unplanned. Lily opened her eyes, blinking rapidly as if she were waking up from a deep sleep. The sound washed over her, but it didn't feel real. She slowly pulled her hands back from the keyboard and placed them in her lap. She looked out at the sea of people standing for her face pale and flushed at the same time. She didn't look triumphant. She looked overwhelmed, like a deer caught in headlights. She wasn't used to this. She was used to being invisible, to playing in empty rooms for herself. This wall of sound was terrifying. Julian Vane stood still a few feet away from the piano. His arms were hanging loosely at his sides, his pen completely forgotten. He looked at the audience, then back at Lily. The arrogance that had defined him earlier had evaporated. His face was stripped bare. For a moment, he just looked old. He looked like a man who had been playing the game for too long and had just been reminded why he started playing in the first place. He watched Lily shrinking into the bench, trying to hide from the noise, and a strange look passed over his eyes. It was a look of genuine respect, mixed with a heavy dose of shame. He slowly walked toward the center of the stage. He didn't wave his hands to quiet the crowd, and he didn't preen for the attention. He just stood there, waiting for the noise to die down naturally. He knew he couldn't stop it anyway. The audience wasn't clapping for him. They were clapping for her. They were apologizing with their hands, trying to make up for the cruelty of the last 10 minutes. Eventually, the cheering began to subside. People sat back down, but the energy in the room was completely different. The air felt electric. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of reverence. No one was whispering anymore. No one was checking their phones. Every eye was fixed on the stage, waiting to see what would happen next. It felt like a verdict was about to be delivered, but this time, the judge wasn't Julian. It was the music itself. Julian took a step closer to the piano. He looked down at Lily. She flinched slightly, bracing herself for another comment. She still expected the bite. She expected him to say something like, "Not bad for an amateur," or "You got lucky." That was how the world worked, in her experience. People built you up just to tear you down. But Julian didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He looked at the audience, his face serious and grave. "I have played that piece," Julian said, his voice soft but carrying easily to the back of the hall. I have played it in Vienna, in London, in New York. I have played it thousands of times. He paused, looking down at his own hands for a second, as if he were seeing them differently. But I have never heard it sound like that, he continued. He turned his gaze back to Lily. I tell my students to play with technique. I tell them to play with precision. I tell them to be perfect. And that is exactly what is wrong with us. We are so busy being perfect that we forget to be human. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. The students leaned forward, hanging on his every word. This wasn't the Julian Vane they had read about in magazines. This wasn't the cynical celebrity. This was a musician speaking to another musician, soul to soul. I made a joke, Julian said, his voice thick with regret. I thought I was being clever. I thought I was entertaining the room, but the truth is, I was being a fool. He looked out at the audience, his eyes scanning the faces of the students who had laughed earlier. We laughed at her clothes. We laughed at her background. We looked at the outside of the box and decided it was empty. We didn't bother to open it and see what was inside. He turned back to Lily. You didn't play the notes, Miss Lily. You played the truth. You played with a depth of emotion that most of us will spend our entire lives trying to find and never will. You took a piece that is often used just to show off, and you made it bleed. Lily felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and fast. She didn't wipe it away this time. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glistening. She saw the honesty in his face. It wasn't a performance. He meant it. I apologize to you, Julian said, bowing his head slightly toward her. It was a small gesture, but coming from a man like him, it meant everything. I was wrong. You taught me a lesson today that I needed to learn. Music is not about who you are on the outside. It is about what you have to give on the inside. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. The atmosphere had shifted from judgment to unity. The divide between the famous rich kids and the scholarship student had been bridged by something that couldn't be bought or sold: raw, undeniable talent. Julian stepped back and gestured toward the piano bench. Please, he said quietly. The stage is yours. Lily didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, but she also wanted to stay. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot stage lights. She stood up slowly. Her legs were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was the adrenaline finally leaving her body. She turned to face the audience. She saw the boy in the white shirt smiling at her now, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. She saw the professors nodding in approval. She gave a small, clumsy curtsy. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. The applause started up again, but this time it was warmer, friendlier. It was the sound of a room welcoming someone into the family. Lily turned and walked back to her seat in the corner, her head held high. She didn't feel like an intruder anymore. She was a musician. And she had been heard. The walk back to her seat felt like walking through a dream. The air in the hall seemed thinner, easier to breathe. As Lily moved down the aisle, the students didn't just watch her, they made way for her. It wasn't a wide, obvious parting of the sea, but a subtle shift. The boy in the white shirt pulled his knees in as she passed, nodding at her with a look of sincere respect. A girl in the row across from hers mouthed the word wow, her eyes wide with genuine admiration. There were no whispers this time, no snickers about her clothes or her shoes. The invisible wall that had separated her from them, built of money and status, had been shattered by the sound of her music. She was no longer the scholarship student who didn't belong, she was the girl who had silenced Julian Vane. Lily sank into her seat in the back corner, her legs feeling like jelly. She placed her worn music bag on her lap and hugged it tight against her chest. Her heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but for the first time all day, it wasn't from fear. It was the aftermath of the storm, a mix of exhaustion and a strange, vibrating lightness. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, the fingers red and pressed from the force of her playing. To anyone else, they looked like ordinary hands, calloused and work-worn. But to her, they felt different. They felt like instruments of power. On the stage, Julian Vane stood alone for a moment behind the microphone. He looked out over the audience, his expression unreadable. He adjusted the stand, tapping it once, a nervous habit he hadn't displayed all day. The master class was technically over, the scheduled time slot had passed, but no one was leaving. The exits were blocked by rows of people still leaning forward, unwilling to break the connection that had formed in the room. "I think," Julian said into the microphone, his voice quieter now, stripped of the booming projection he had used earlier, "that we have covered enough technique for one day." A few light chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they were kind chuckles, sharing a joke rather than laughing at someone. "Usually," he continued, looking down at his hands as he smoothed the fabric of his expensive trousers, "I end these sessions by giving a list of things to work on. Posture, dynamics, finger strength. But today there is nothing for me to teach you that you haven't already learned." He paused, scanning the rows of faces until his eyes found Lily in the back corner. He didn't point at her, but he held her gaze for a long second. Lily felt a flush rise up her neck again, but it wasn't the hot burn of shame. It was a warm glow. "We spend so much time trying to sound perfect," Julian said, turning his attention back to the crowd. "We buy the right instruments. We wear the right clothes. We practice until the notes are clean, until there isn't a single mistake. We think that is what music is. Perfection." He shook his head slowly. "But what we heard today, that wasn't perfection. It was something far more important. It was truth. And you cannot teach that. You cannot buy it. You can only live it." The room was utterly still. The students who had spent their lives chasing grades and competitions sat in silence, letting his words sink in. It was a rare moment where the teacher stopped teaching and started learning from the student. "I want to thank you all for coming," Julian said. "And I want to thank the student who played today. She reminded me why I fell in love with the piano in the first place. Not for the applause. Not for the fame. But for the feeling of the wood and the wires, and the way a song can say what words cannot." He stepped back from the microphone, and without another word, walked off the stage. He didn't take a bow. He didn't wave. He just walked into the wings, a solitary figure leaving the spotlight he had commanded so effortlessly just 20 minutes ago. It was an uncharacteristically humble exit for a man known for his ego, and the audience noticed. They didn't clap as he left, they watched him go with a quiet, thoughtful reverence. As the stage lights dimmed slightly, the spell that held the room began to break. People started to stand up, the rustle of fabric and the shuffle of feet filling the air. But the mood was different from the beginning of the class. The snooty cliques of friends grouping together were gone. Instead, people were talking to each other across the aisles, strangers discussing what they had just heard. Lily sat in her seat for a long time, waiting for the aisle to clear. She didn't want to push past people, to have them look at her and talk to her. She just wanted to be alone with her thoughts for a little while longer. She felt drained, like a battery that had been used up completely. But underneath the exhaustion was a deep, burning coal of satisfaction. "You were amazing." The voice came from close by. Lily looked up to see the boy in the white shirt standing in the aisle next to her. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't looking down at her. He was looking her right in the eye, his face open and earnest. "Thank you," Lily whispered. She was surprised her voice worked at all. "I mean it," he said, shifting his weight nervously. "I've been playing for 10 years, and I don't think I've ever made anyone feel anything like that. It was terrifying, but beautiful." Lily offered him a small, shy smile. "I was just playing," she said softly. "No," he shook his head. "You weren't. And we all knew it. Even Vane knew it. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen." He paused, looking a bit awkward, then stuck out his hand. "I'm David, by the way." Lily looked at his hand for a moment, surprised. Then she reached out and shook it. His grip was firm and warm. "Lily," she said. "Nice to meet you, Lily," David said, and he actually meant it. He gave her a little nod, then turned to leave. "See you around." He walked away up the aisle, disappearing into the crowd. Lily sat back, staring at the spot where he had stood. It was such a small interaction, just a handshake and a few words, but it felt massive. It was the first time anyone had really seen her here. Not the scholarship girl, not the quiet student, but Lily. Eventually, the hall emptied out. The sun had completely set, and the room was now lit only by the emergency lights and the glow of the city coming through the high windows. A janitor pushed a mop in the distance, the squeak echoing in the vast space. Lily stood up, swinging her bag over her shoulder. She felt heavy, her muscles aching, but her spirit felt light. She walked slowly down the central aisle toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed on the hard floor. As she passed the stage, she glanced up one last time. The grand piano sat there in the dim light, black and imposing. It looked innocent now, just a piece of furniture. But she knew what lived inside it. She knew that as long as she had her hands and her heart, she had a voice that no one could mock into silence. She reached the large double glass doors at the back of the hall and pushed them open. The cool night air rushed in to meet her, smelling of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. It wasn't a sweet smell, but to Lily, it smelled like freedom. She stepped out into the night, pulling her thin cardigan tighter around her against the chill. The street lights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. A bus was pulling up to the curb down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Lily started walking toward it. She didn't have a fancy car waiting for her. She had a long ride home on a crowded bus, and a shift at her part-time job the next morning. But as she walked, she found herself straightening her spine. She lifted her chin. The fear that had dogged her every step for weeks was gone. She knew there would be other challenges. She knew not everyone would be like David, and not everyone would apologize like Julian. The world was still a hard place for a girl with empty pockets. But she had a secret now. She knew that when the world tried to crush her, when the people in charge tried to make her feel small, she had a place to go. She had a storm inside her that she could unleash whenever she needed to. She had music. She climbed the steps of the bus and dropped her coins into the box. The driver nodded at her, distracted. Lily moved to the back of the bus and sat by the window. As the bus lurched forward, merging into the stream of city lights, Lily rested her hand against the cold glass. She watched the world go by, a small smile touching her lips. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the one playing the music. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.